welcome to the panel discussion titled, Is the Best Governance Strategy a Boring One? And I think the folks in this session listening are people who don't judge a book by its cover, because on the surface, this sounds like a dry topic. And we know that in parallel to this, there's a session all about AI and LLMs. So, if you've entered into the wrong room and you're expecting the excitement of buzz terms around LLM, please move to the door. We won't be offended. Okay, no, people are still here, so we're good. This isn't a dry topic, certainly not with the amazing panel we have here today. So before we get into the panel discussion itself, and as we wait for more people to come in, good opportunity for me to introduce myself. So I'm James Hurst. I'm one of the co-founders of Tyke. I'm based in London. You'll see the buses going behind me all the time. But as Tyke is a default remote business, I spend a lot of my time traveling around the world, meeting with our team and our clients wherever they're located. And Tyke works with some of the world's largest companies, from cutting edge consumer technology brands through to major banks, automotive, travel, theme parks, telcos. We're sector agnostic. And it means for me and the team, we get to see a wide variety of approaches to governance. And in many cases, complete absences of governance, if we're honest. So that means the topic of this panel is pretty close to my heart. My first job, and I'm aging myself here, my first job was dial-up internet support. So I can still recognize the glorious screeches and boinging sounds of a V90 dial-up connection. And from that role, I then went on to found web hosting and web design businesses and later led a digital consultancy. And the common thread for me in my career has always been fast-moving internet technology businesses, typically in startups and scale-ups. And for me and for those organizations, there have been few less welcome phrases than, but is it compliant? Or have you done the assessment? Or are you using the template for that? That's not what most fast-moving organizations want to hear. And sadly, those kind of phrases are often associated with governance. That idea of restriction and of normalization can feel like kryptonite to a really fast-moving team. So what I want to dig into in this session is this a stereotype? Is there truth in that? Does governance always become complex and burdensome? Or is that just a misnomer? So that's a neat segue onto the topic. Is the best governance strategy a boring one? So the ground rules for this session, I'm going to dig into various aspects of that question. I'll pose some questions to the panel, but really importantly, to all the folks who are dialed in and listening, everyone on this call is able to pose questions using the Q&A functionality at the bottom or just into the chat on the side. So please do pose your own questions. We've seen great discussions going on over the last few hours. When you post your question, we might not get to it immediately. We might save it for the end, but please don't be discouraged. And if you do submit a question, please feel free to nominate a member of the panel to answer it. Put us on the spot if you want our specific answer. Okay, so let's start by introducing our esteemed panelists. Gentlemen, hello. You're going to have a maximum of 2 minutes to introduce yourself. I want to know your job role, and where API governance impacts your working life. So first, Sri, a little about you, your role, and API governance.
Thanks, James. Thanks for providing me the opportunity for inviting me as a member on this panelist and to share my thoughts today and to listen to my other API evangelists and experts out here on this call. But before we really dwell into the details of this topic about API governance, I wanted to quickly introduce myself. I'm Sri, Senior Vice President and Global Head of Integration Solutions at Coforge. And I'm, in fact, myself a hands-on integration practitioner with 26 years of experience, where I'm personally involved in delivering APIs for a number of customers across the globe for the last 14 plus years. As you rightly said, James, API governance and adherence to its best practices is something which is close to my heart as well. Because as head of solution engineering, I have numerous conversations internally with my fellow architects and developers within Coforge, along with that with our customers on the need of having one and the benefits that organizations get from API governance. So happy to share my thoughts today.
Great, thanks, Sri. Next, Bruno, a little about yourself, your role, and how API governance is a part of your life.
Thank you, James and Tyke for for inviting me, for the opportunity to be here among, such great panelists and other speakers. It's a fantastic opportunity. So yeah, you already know my name, Bruno Pedro. I'm Portuguese, based in Spain. And I've been in the API space for about 20 years. I worked, in a number of different kinds of companies, from big telcos to, 2, 3 people startups, and everything in between. I think I have a broad perspective on about APIs. I've been on both the producer and also the consumer side many times, switching heads very frequently. Worked for vendors of API related tools, but also for other kinds of companies. And I happen to care about a lot about what non-technical API consumers can or cannot do with API. So I see myself as a kind of a voice of the non-technical client, if you can call it that. And that's why I wrote and published a book last year with the title of Building an API Product. So it's dedicated to product managers and those people that wish to learn more about APIs and wish to understand how to build an API from scratch. What brings me to API governance? Since about a little over 6 months ago, I'm leading an API governance program at a large retailer. So that's my latest interest around API governance.
Thank you. Thanks, Bruno. And finally, Bill, a little about yourself, your role, and how API governance is in focus for you at the moment.
Sounds great. Thanks, James. Thanks so much for the invitation. It's great to be here with so many people I respect in the API community. A little bit about me. I'm a tech journalist and editor. I work remotely. I'm originally from Seattle, but now I live in Maine on the East Coast in the US. And basically, I've been covering enterprise IT topics for over a decade now. And a big part of that has been a focus on the API economy. I began covering APIs for programmable web back in 2014, and since 2015, I've been the editor-in-chief of Nordic APIs, one of the largest dedicated API communities on the globe. And basically, we run a high-impact blog about APIs. We cover API design, security, testing, business models, API standards that are emerging, and other topics. And we talk about governance and best practices like all the time. This is our bread and butter. This is what we love to discuss. Nordic is also an event series, and I have to mention our yearly platform summit was just announced. Registration literally went up today, so I have to put a link to that in the chat right now. Really excited about that. We're getting about 60 speakers for this curated lineup with great keynotes and great panel discussions toward the end of the year in the fall in Stockholm. So call for speakers is open for that too. Outside of Nordic APIs, I freelance for a handful of enterprise IT publications, and recently I've written about API sprawl concerns and API governance for publications like The New Stack, InfoWorld, and CIO.com. So yeah, that's just a nutshell of my role in this.
Fantastic. Thank you. And good plug for the platform summit.
Yeah, I got it in, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. We were big fans of that last year. So we've got a real range of experience here, lots of expertise, and really interestingly, different viewpoints I think we're going to see. So going to move in with my first contention. And so to the audience here, please dive in with comments or questions as we get through this. So to set the scene on this, I'm COO of Tyke, and I've held operations roles in a number of companies. I've been a project director and a producer, and in all of those roles, I've been a really big advocate for that kind of startup way of doing things, about moving fast and breaking things, about 80% and done now is better than 100% later. And of course, ship the minimum viable proposition. And that's because the organizations we work for, we've got to deliver. We've got to deliver at pace, deliver efficiently, and ensure all of those resources and attention that we have are focused on things that move the needle. My co-founder's favorite saying is, your attention is your most valuable asset, spend it wisely. So my contention to the panel, to the people in the room, is that governance is not necessarily where every organization should spend its time, energy, and resources. Because the pressure for good governance on a scaled up bank or a big healthcare provider is really significant. But perhaps the pressure on governance for a smaller AI startup, few people working out of a single office, maybe that's less. So I wanted to turn to Sri first and say, look, you've got this experience across a really wide range of organizations. Do you think there's like a tipping point in scale, or maybe at certain sectors, or some other measure that says, look, below this point, governance is, you can ignore it, or is it never safe to ignore it?
Well, James, very interesting question. Well, from my introduction, you may guess what would be my answer. I'm definitely a promoter of API governance. In fact, I would want to bring this into light with some of the questions that I often hear from our customers from day in, day out. Why do I need one? And what kind of a roles do I need to really think about if I have to set up an API governance? And how big should my team be? And most importantly, how much of occupied will they be on these tasks of API governance? Because everyone has their day-to-day work to do in addition to this kind of role. So my experience, James, it all depends upon the size and maturity of an organization's, their adaptation towards an API, towards API in their organizations, and most importantly, understanding their standard operating procedures on how they design, how they build, how they secure, and how they govern and control their APIs. In my view, API governance cuts across sectors. I would not say it's different from sector to sector, but I see a common theme in terms of typical objectives and KPIs, and how do you typically measure it. For example, I work with customers in banking and finance. And for them, security, efficiency, compliance is something which is very, very important when it comes to, open banking and ensuring that you have real-time access to your data and providing the customer that kind of a centralized view of what accounts do they hold with you as a banker. In terms of retail, I can share my thoughts around supply chain management. I can think about omni-channel initiatives and where retailers rely on APIs for integration with their suppliers, their manufacturers, and in fact, even their logistics providers. If I have to give another spin around insurance, again, from an insurance, I would say key aspects I would think about is security and compliance, such as GDPR, HIPAA, etc. But other than that, what I see unique with insurance is interoperability, which is purely because they interact with a lot of claims management processes and they interact with a lot of underwriting systems, and hence the way in which they exchange data and the data formats and the standards, etc., is pretty important. So just to summarize, all in all, James, I feel API governance is an investment, and if you look at it in a longer run, it definitely it helps you to measure your return on investment, and it also reduces total cost of ownership. And most importantly, I see in my experience, it brings in a lot of business agility.
Thanks for that. Is there anyone else who's got a counter view or wants to support that?
I just agree with Sri that it's something that cuts across sectors. I don't see it so much as only a sector-specific topic, but more so related to the activity of the organization and its size. I'm seeing API governance come up in conversations with large organizations that are managing a disparate API portfolio. They have a bunch of different competing styles in use in terms of formats or actually, the style of the API as it's designed. Many organizations are juggling different API management vendors. So some governance can come in to consolidate some of those, competing management solutions or gateways. I also think it benefits API first companies in general. If you're building with that idea of externalizing these APIs to consumers, they should be reliable, they should be resilient, and governance is a big part of that, ensuring that it actually achieves those goals.
So you're saying that as an impatient founder who's like, just ship it. I have to still have to pay attention to governance, right? We're not getting away from that, regardless of what sector I'm in, what scale I'm in. It's still a foundational principle.
Ideally, that's the best practice in mind, right?
Absolutely. Okay. So look, second contention then. Like we've got a panel here of 4 creative people, problem solvers, innovators, founders, entrepreneurs, and we've all experienced the kind of development of creative approaches that get an advantage by moving, I hate the term, but outside of the box, doing something new, taking a calculated risk. And I think intrinsically bound up with the term governance is this idea of constraints, normalization, standardization, and stasis, which I think for a lot of creative people and maybe creative organizations, they spend a lot of time trying to avoid that and trying to drive change, trying to do the new, trying to innovate. So I thought on this topic, I'd turn first to Bruno. Now, you've written extensively on the topic of APIs, the experience of creating and using APIs. And so I'm going to reach back to this diagram that I first saw, that I think you created about 10 years ago, back when Tyke was still a baby, and I first saw this, described as the API hierarchy of needs. And I thought what was interesting about this is that I can see how governance might drive improvements in reliability, for instance. But perhaps is it a constraint on the other needs in this pyramid? Creativity, is that held back by that? I mean, could you speak to this challenge of implementing governance on the one hand while still empowering creative, innovative teams? Is that a conflict or not?
Yeah, that's a great question, and not very easy to to answer without it depends kind of answer. But let's try to be more specific, more direct. So I see that that's great that you brought that diagram. I haven't seen it for some time myself as well. It's interesting that as the higher you go into the hierarchy, the more consumer specific those needs are. So basically, or the less you as the producer can control those needs, basically. So for example, on the very top layer, creativity, the one that you were mentioning now, how does governance affect that? First thoughts would be that governance would make consumers kind of block consumers from being able to being more creative. But if you look closer to how governance can be applied, and if we now split into the creativity of your own developers, the developers that maintain and produce the API, and also the developers from the consumer side, governance actually makes your API building more agile, as Sri was mentioning before. So what does that mean? So for example, imagine that you are on the producer side and you want to be able to introduce change. So being able to introduce change is a synonym with innovation, so being more creative. So if you're not able to introduce change, it means that you can't be creative. So creativity is the ability to change things and to move things around, right? So governance can help you there, because if you have the right governance tools and processes in place, it means that you can introduce change without fearing of breaking things on the consumer side, right? So that's one area where API governance can help and can actually be, positive towards creativity. So the impact can be positive. On the consumer side, if you have an API that is always crashing, doesn't doesn't work reliably, or produces strange results from time to time, you're not able to to experiment with the API, to build new things with the API so freely. So governance also helps there, because it introduces again processes and makes sure that your API is reliable, that it follows certain rules, is compliant, and there are certain kinds of tests in place to make sure that the API doesn't crash and works reliably. So it also helps on the consumer side, because the developers then can be can consume the API in a more creative way and experiment with it without the fear of breaking things, basically. So I think on both sides, governance can actually help and can actually open doors if applied correctly. Obviously, if you look at it from a, we have many rules, and you can't break any rule, and it's very hard to move things. Then it, everything looks, very, very difficult to use, and you're, it feels like you're not helping with creativity. But I don't think that's the case.
Okay, understood. Thank you. And I mean, I think your point about, when it's implemented well is interesting. I think there's a from a, let's say, the more business side of an organization, there's sometimes perhaps a perception that some of this it's I don't know, arcane tech busy work, and it seems impenetrable. I'm sure that some of the, there's been some fantastic demonstrations in the session today with people deploying Kubernetes pods and just auto deploying everything. It's all automated, end-to-end GitOps. And I think sometimes the value of that and the impact it can deliver is perhaps lost on less technical folks. So I really appreciate the way you described this in terms of the reliability, but also enabling creativity. I don't know if anyone else has a contrary view on that, because it seems like everyone here so far is pro governance. I know we're on a governance conference. Anyone running into blockers on this? Okay, we'll move past then. We'll take it as read. So another quick contention. The title of the talk: best governance strategy is a boring one? ? And the context on this is we've seen organizations time and time again who've spent time, attention, and focus on developing really extensive API governance. But you look at the results a year later, and the real challenge is folks are using loopholes. They're using workarounds. They're ignoring and then asking for forgiveness later and just doing anything to work around them. And in the worst examples, that governance then becomes shelfware. Whether it's a system, a process, or a document, it gets sidestepped. Is the issue with that kind of situation where you go into the org and good intentions are there, but change doesn't happen? Is that because the governance is too complex, too ambitious? I mean, Sri, turning to you, did you have experience of orgs kind of starting simple and scaling over time? Or is governance something where the nature of it is get it all right, get it all planned, and then mandate it and ensure it's successful that way?
Oh, I would say, let me answer it in twofold, James. So number one is when I look at, or when we look at defining governance, guardrails around governance, I would keep few things in mind. One is it has to be nimble. It should be easily understandable, easy to follow, easy to measure, and easy to report. So as long as you have those 4 principles in hand, that's very important. And to answer your question, is that needed to be on day one? Not necessary. So again, it goes back to my response to your first question, James, and the audience, where you can always start small. You can always mature it as you grow. But what's very important is you keep an eye on your KPIs. For example, as Bruno said on the diagram, which was quite interesting, which is, the KPIs that you define on API governance, when you're defining an API, when you're building an API, you look at aspects like scalability, reliability, performance, high availability, disaster recovery, etc. But on the other side, when you look at what would be my KPIs when I'm putting an API into testing, is around how efficient is my API performing in a test environment, in a load testing environment, etc., and how do I really automate my test cases? So API governance, in my view, it's something that it's not like you define it once, but you got to at least do it once a quarter, in my experience. That's what I've seen with our customers, where we have socialized these events with them, with various stakeholders. It could be architects, developers, testers, a lot of people coming in. We look at what are the guardrails that we have defined, which may be relevant at that point of time, but it's equally important to understand that it's even relevant for today's world. Is it relevant for today from 6 months when I've defined it, right? So that's really relevant. And we got to improvise it based on lessons that we learn. It's a continuous journey of, checking whether it's relevant and how do I improvise it based on the various governance sessions that we do with and what do our developers and what do our architects feel about it? Because end of the day, I don't necessarily see that any API governance will hinder a project from implementation. It would definitely add value if you plan ahead and make sure your governance is embedded into the right processes within your development lifecycle, then it's always successful.
Thanks for that. Bruno, I know that we were talking the other day around this, and you mentioned that you'd seen these examples of a KPI being set and that just driving, I guess, almost opposite behaviors. Is that a common thing?
Yeah, I don't know if it's common across, many companies, but I've been seeing, some of that happening. So the way I see it, if API governance, if the program is mandated or if it's set up, top down kind of strategy, I think people will find ways to game it and find ways around it, basically. So the example, I think here, there are many examples. One example is having one rule to check if the API has a description. So, and then usually people add like a 2 words or 3 word description. And then you change the rule to make it like, okay, it needs to have at least 100 character description. Then people add a bunch of, meaningless words. And I mean, you keep changing things and people keep, trying to find ways to game the system. And I don't think that's the right way to do things. I think that it should have a stronger, stronger part of it should be around training, around explaining people what governance is about, and actually finding, a common element. Sri mentioned KPIs, but finding a common element. It depends on the organization and company, but finding a common element for what the API governance is delivering. So why are we doing API governance? What is it for? So people can understand and people can actually want to follow it. So,
sure.
So you don't have to kind of make them do it, basically.
Yeah, and I think you can see in the chat on the side, that's been a common theme, people talking about if the problems and the issues are invisible to the CEO, then nothing happens. If developers don't care about the bigger picture, they don't get governed. So a lot of it, as I think Chris has just posted there, it's not always about API governance, it's people governance, and it's that squishy problem of communication. We're almost out of time, and I'll get told off if we overrun, but I really quickly wanted to touch on a final topic, which is around money, because again, it's close to my heart as founder, entrepreneur. Is, we're in this cycle where we're trying to get to a point where efficiency is everything, and people talk about ROI in engineering teams, and so, Bill, this is something you've written about and spoken about before. I mean, is governance, is it an overhead that people should be looking at? Can we streamline that bit so we can get more productivity? Or how best does this relate to ROI on what engineers and software developers do?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question. And governance in many organizations is still at kind of an immature level. So we don't have the best case studies to answer this question with like full, accuracy. But I believe that governance can drive a better ROI overall, rather than just simply being another added overhead. Because it's more of a practice rather than like another tooling subscription. Basically, yes, you're right to point out we're in this economic cycle. Everyone's trying to do more with less. Spending is tight. There's layoffs in tech. Budgets are under more scrutiny than ever before, really. If you zoom out a little bit to just the developer class at large, everyone's obsessed with productivity. So they're looking at like the DORA space or DX core developer productivity metrics, looking at things like deployment frequency, lead time for changes, etc. I think API governance can be measured with some of that, but you have to take kind of an interesting perspective to consider the ROI from APIs and API platforms and governance, because it's not exactly what those typical coding behaviors can be attributed to. I think something that's very realistic is looking in, reduction in broken client integrations. This is something that Atlassian has spoken out about, or shared, I should say, as a benefit of their internal governance framework. And they've actually, resulted in reducing broken client integrations for their partners who actually use the APIs. I think that's like a beneficial metric to look at, Is this actually improving the end experiences? If yes, that's a great argument for continuing this practice. A lot has been said about improved development productivity at large. I think, looking at the number of developers using some sort of governance framework, if you have that internally, looking at like time to hello world, time to first value, I think that can be attributed to business success. There's so much more we could say. I know we're running out of time, but correlating ROI with
good points.
producing,
I think that these are they relate to this same point that we've made, I think, which is this idea of you need to get creative in terms of demonstrating the relationship between this activity and the higher level outcome for the organization. And certainly from the non-technical audience, where it's more about elevating that conversation up. So it's not seen as, oh, this is some tooling we're buying, which makes developers' lives easier, or it's not some kind of administrative overhead. It is actually that Atlassian idea is a fantastic example of, as an organization, this hits our bottom line. When this breaks, we lose customers. So interesting points. You're right, we are out of time. There's literally one of those hooks going to come around, grab me by the neck and pull me off stage in a minute, because they know what I'm like. Look, it's been a really interesting conversation. We've really quickly, to recap, we talked about governance. Is it essential? I tried to be the founder and say, come on, just get stuff done. I was shouted down, fine. I suggested that perhaps we all want to go off and be creative individuals, and governance gets in the way. Again, been corrected on that. Thank you, Bruno. You've highlighted that that's not the case. We've talked about the fact that governance does not have to be mandated from the top as a fully complete picture before it starts. Start simple, develop over time, and think really carefully about those KPIs. And then related that to the same point about ROI. How do you change those KPIs? How do you relate them to business ROI, business KPIs? Because otherwise it will be seen as overhead. It will be seen as one of those things that we should just trim that off because, we've got to cut our budget by 5%. So let's just drop that a little bit. So really good discussion. So much more we could talk about. I know there's lots of comments in the chat. If there's a question there we didn't get around to, I'm sorry, we will pick it up afterwards. Folks, thanks a lot. Bill, Sri, Bruno, really appreciate your time. Thanks for everyone for listening and contributing. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the session today.
Thanks so much.